where we're talking estate planning and how to best arrange your assets, both now and into the future. Still with me in studio is Shaun Latter, financial advisor at FinLogic, Michelle Himan, legal marketing advisor at Liberty, and Arnold Shapiro, director of Eversheds. Now, before we continue with our discussion, let's take a quick look at another viewer's question we received. It comes from John in Midrand, and he asks, I've heard that a trust is a good mechanism to reduce estate duty and protect assets. Is this true? Okay, well, obviously, Arnold, I'm gonna pick up where we sort of left off before the ad break, and that was really around trusts and the role of your response to a question like John's. What would you say?
The advantage of a trust is that it pegs the value of one's estate. The practical issue is that the person owns the asset and the trust is then registered and the trust owns nothing. How does one transport the assets from the client to the trust? If it's given to the trust, there's going to be donations tax of 20%. So what happens is you sell your assets to the trust at a market-related value. If the assets are worth 5 million, you now have a loan of 5 million and the trust owns your assets. The reason assets are sold to the trust is various. Number one, there's hopefully capital growth. In the fullness of time, that 5 million may be worth 10 million. On your death, you will only pay estate duty on 5 million. And if you've structured your affairs properly, you may even have whittled down that loan to nothing, and therefore you will pay no estate duty. The advantages are that now you have a trust that owns 10 million. There's no executor's fees on your death, which is a saving of approximately 4 million, which is 400,000 rand. There is no estate duty, which would be a saving of 2 million rand. And in addition, there's automatic succession. So as long as your trust deed is properly drafted and the class is big enough, you have an ideal situation which is win-win-win-win. In addition to that, the income earned in the trust could be distributed to beneficiaries, taxable in their hands, which dilutes the income tax. So there's every advantage to a trust. The practical issues are that when you do sell the assets to a trust, there will be a capital gains tax implication. But as long as you sell it and don't give it, you at least will save the 20% donations tax and estate duty on the growth.
Michelle, just quickly, I mean, we've heard of all the advantages of a trust, and I agree with each and every one of them. Of course, setting up a trust and having a trust has become somewhat of a trend in South Africa, and I think a lot of people are potentially setting these things up for all the wrong reasons.
Definitely.
What are your comments on that? Yeah.
Well, I think, at one point there was a time where trusts were quite fashionable, and you clearly weren't wealthy if you didn't have a trust, and vice versa. That was certainly the perception. And I think that we just need to go back to our clients and have a look at why did they actually set up this trust in the first place, and then have they kept up to date with changing legislation. You'll find trusts that were set up 20 years ago with perhaps the donor's brother and sister and wife as the trustees. And the absence of an objective trustee is going to have an impact on the validity of that trust. We need to make sure that we have an objective trustee, and I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that we sit with when we look at the validity of trusts these days.
Is the old alter ego syndrome.
Exactly.
It's meant to be a trust, it's meant to be something that's not controlled by you.
But it's actually not.
But it's actually not, and there's certainly case law to prove that
100%.
The courts are no longer looking at it as a separate asset, but an asset in your own right. Shaun, obviously we spoke about the potential of estate duty being scrapped. I think a lot of people have set up trusts purely on the premise that they're going to save on estate duty. What's going to happen when potentially we have to unwind all of these?
Well, that's a very interesting question. We have a lot of consultations where we need to determine whether trusts that have been set up for clients are still appropriate or are still in place for the right reasons. If we leave the estate duty implications out of the equation, then we're simply looking at asset protection. And then a client has to ask himself, but am I really such a high-risk client that I would need to protect these assets so fiercely? So I think that's a very important point to consider. And as Michelle said, we definitely need to determine and to confirm continually whether the structures that we have in place and whether the estate plans that we have in place are actually appropriate, because times do change. And we could have one small law change that will affect the plan quite dramatically.
Yeah, sure. Michelle, I think a large portion of the discussion around trust has been a living trust, an inter vivos trust. In other words, it's one that's set up while I'm still alive. Testamentary trusts, which are often set up through the intentions of a will, are quite different. set up for different purposes, and perhaps it's clear to maybe make a clear distinction between the two of those.
Well, Shaun, the testamentary trust only comes into existence when you pass away, and those assets are then transferred into the testamentary trust. And often people use these, especially where there are minor children involved, or where they want to, for example, protect a spouse, and set up a structure that will allow the spouse or the children to own the assets, but the assets will be managed on their behalf by somebody possibly more qualified or suitable to make those types of decisions. And the huge advantage that you have with a testamentary trust is it's really, really easy to set up. You simply put a clause in your will that indicates that you want to set up a testamentary trust. Who are the trustees going to be? Who are the beneficiaries? You can even give instructions as to how capital and income is going to be distributed. And of course, then you don't sit with the situation that you have with an inter vivos trust or a living trust, where you have to lose control of that asset during your lifetime. Because, as I say, it only comes into effect when you pass away. So it adds huge value.
Yeah, and really there for minor dependents to try and sort of give them some direction and
give them that protection.
Give them the protection that they potentially need when both the parents aren't around anymore. Werner, just quickly, and I want to wrap up really around looking at life policies and the role they could potentially have in terms of mitigating the estate duty. Of course, by taking out the policy, one can actually make the life assurance company pay for that estate duty liability.
Yeah, Shaun, that's quite a possibility. At the end of the day, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but life assurance can certainly be used in a very easy and mostly affordable way to plug any gaps that there might be in the estate. So life assurance can be quite effective in paying for estate duties, in paying for any other taxes that are envisioned in the estate plan. So, you know, with a lot of clients, it might be a bit too late in the cycle of their life to start transferring assets into trust structures. And the expense to that might actually ruin them completely, where putting a life insurance policy into place would be quite an effective and simple solution to a financial problem.
To a financial problem such as that. You mentioned the age. 10 seconds very quickly, Arnold, just around the role of potentially putting money into retirement annuities. We know that retirement funds are free of estate duty. Because it's potentially a disallowed contribution, we could save on income tax as well. Is this a viable option for those with surplus assets and relatively old?
Well, very much so. The most important aspect is that as of last year, January, it is not included in the calculation of estate duty. So there's your first major saving of 20%. And by putting funds in, there are the tax implications and advantages. Very much so. It's worth pursuing.
Wonderful. Well, Arnold, Michelle, Werner, thank you so much for your time and sharing of your knowledge tonight. I certainly enjoyed the discussion, and it certainly sounds that there's a lot more options available for people to look at when doing their estate planning. Before we go, it's time for a quick look at our weekly viewers' tips. This week, of course, our tips relate to estate planning.
Welcome to FinLogic's Viewers Tips, guiding you to financial success. If there is no will, there is no estate plan. There are a number of formalities which need to be adhered to ensure that your will is valid. The most important being it must be in writing, dated and correctly signed, and witnessed by 2 independent, competent witnesses. By regularly updating your will, you will be sure that your last wishes are carried out the way you intended. Be careful of equally dividing your assets amongst your heirs, as this could lead to having your assets sold and negatively impacting on your family. If you have minor children, ensure that you have appointed a legal guardian for them in your will. You could also make provision for them through a testamentary trust. If you have insurance policies, make sure that each policy has a nominated beneficiary, as insurance companies pay the nominated beneficiary and not the beneficiary stipulated in a will. All proceeds with no limit left to a surviving spouse are free of estate duty. And with the latest changes allowing your 3.5 million rand abatement to be rolled over to your surviving spouse, allows a joint estate of 7 million to be free of estate duty. Should you have assets offshore, it is best to have a separate will for these assets. There are 2 types of trusts. Inter vivos trusts are established while you are alive, and a testamentary trust is established on your death through your will. Trusts serve a specific purpose in estate planning, and that is to ensure continuity and protection of an asset. This comes at a price. income tax and capital gains tax is taxed at a maximum. So trusts need to be correctly used to be effective. On a joint estate exceeding 7 million rand, an inter vivos trust can become useful to minimize, if not eradicate, estate duty, currently levied at 20%. If you do have an inter vivos trust, then make sure that you and your spouse donate up to 100,000 rand each year according to the donations tax exemption, as this will help to reduce your personal estate. The most important part of setting up a proper estate plan with your financial advisor is to ensure that there is liquidity in your estate. This means that there are sufficient funds in your estate to settle all liabilities and provide your loved ones with future financial protection. Retirement annuities are now being used in estate planning as they are free of estate duty. And in addition to this, if there was no allowable tax deduction on the contributions, then the funds are paid out tax-free. Negotiate your executors' fees in advance with your executors, especially on large estates, as 3.99% levied on an estate could equate to a huge value, which could rather benefit your